Now, surprisingly enough, the people of Great Britain did not buy this was an accident. So the government, Henry and his advisors, decide that they're going to conduct an investigation of the death of William to determine whether Henry is at fault for William's death. Can you imagine how this is going to go, right? The government investigating itself. Sort of like Eric Holder being investigated by the Department of Justice, right? Now look, I spent close to 10 years, a little over 9 years in the criminal law system. I was a prosecutor for around 9 years. I was on the defense side for about 2 years. I watched the Fast and Furious hearings, and let me tell you something, it ruined me. I am so cynical. You will not see anything happen from Benghazi. You will not see anything happen from these IRS hearings. You will not see anything happen from the investigations into the NSA. You're not going to see anything happen in any of these congressional dog and pony shows. Because nothing happened with Fast and Furious. I watched those hearings. I can guarantee you two things. Number one, we did not see all the evidence that the Congress had against Eric Holder. That is a prosecutorial fact. All the evidence that an officer gives, a prosecutor never makes it to the courtroom floor. Never. But of the evidence that we did see, number two, if they had this evidence against me, I would not be getting a finger wagging from Congress. I would be under a federal prison, because in this country, when you aid and abet a murder, that makes you a principal to the murder, which makes you guilty of the murder as if you had pulled the trigger itself. And Eric Holder is unequivocally a murderer. So what did we do to Eric Holder? We had a hearing. We found him in contempt. When was the last time you read Article 2, Section 4 in the Constitution? Do you know what it is? Article 2, Section 4 of the Constitution is the impeachment clause. We don't know what it says, so we're allowing Congress to get away with something that they should never be getting away with. It says, Congress shall remove from office. Now, anytime you see that word shall in a legal document, there is no choice. It is a mandate. It must be done. So the Constitution says, Congress must, without any options, remove from office. Who? The President, the Vice President, and a third category we always forget, all civil officers. Isn't Eric Holder a civil officer? Well, what do we remove them for according to Article 2, Section 4? High crimes and misdemeanors, right? Didn't we find Eric Holder in contempt? Isn't contempt a misdemeanor? Did we not impeach Bill Clinton for that very same thing? Article 2, Section 4 demands that Congress must remove Eric Holder from office. No options there. So why have you not heard of a single person in Congress, even your most conservative, constitutionally minded ones, even mention the impeachment of Eric Holder?
Start a group.
Yeah, good luck with that one too. Hey. Henry is not appeasing the people with this investigation because it's going to determine just as what you think. Henry is not at fault. Imagine that. So Henry is now on the throne, but the people aren't buying this. They did not believe in the investigation. So Henry makes two promises to the people. The first thing that he does is he promises that he's going to marry an Anglo-Saxon woman. Now, the Anglo-Saxons were the majority of the population in Great Britain. So Henry and his advisors have figured out that they can appease the people by first appeasing the majority. But it's interesting to notice what he's doing here. He's appeasing the majority by giving them representation on the throne. I believe this was a gesture on Henry's part and his administration to show that they were going to move back towards the ruling style of Edward the Confessor. Now, William does the second thing, which is why we're really talking about William. The most important thing that William does is he signs the first document in the genealogy of our Constitution. Our Constitution has a genealogy. There are 5 documents that had to be written over 700 years in order for our Declaration of Independence, our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, to look as they do, and even to exist. That first document is called the 1100 Charter of Liberties. The 1100 Charter of Liberties was a promise from Henry that kings would no longer be evil and oppressive. Then he makes a short list of things that kings can't do anymore, because if they do them, they'll be evil and oppressive. Now, it's not really that interesting that he made the list. It's even more interesting what's on the list. Now, I'm not going to read you the whole list, but I want to share with you 2 things. Because Henry declares, remember, if kings do this, they're evil and oppressive. He says, if any of my baron or earl shall die, their heirs shall not be forced to purchase their inheritance, but shall retrieve it through force of law and custom. Because you see, a king in 1100 England recognized that when you have to purchase your inheritance from the government, that is evil and oppressive. Isn't that what inheritance tax is? How is it that a king was more dedicated to liberty that he was able to identify that inheritance tax is evil and oppressive, and is some concept that actually eludes our government today? Well, the second thing Henry says is that if any of my barons should commit a crime, they will not bind themselves to the crown as was done in the time of my father and brother, but shall stand for the crime as the law demands and makes amends as are appropriate. Because Henry, the king in 1100 England, knew that when the men who made the laws considered themselves above the law, that was evil and oppressive. Well, Henry signs the 1100 Charter of Liberties because he wants to appease the people. He doesn't really believe a word of what he says. He's simply signing the document. But it's not about the government. It's about the people. And they now have a promise from the king. Now, I want you to keep in mind as we go through this that we are taught that because we are technologically advanced, that we are somehow intellectually advanced. And that's the whole reason why we don't have to look at our framers of this nation when trying to figure out how our Constitution is supposed to be applied. Because remember, they're just a bunch of dumb, rich, white guys who love themselves and their money and nothing else. And after all, they're dead. But I've already told you, we have a king in 1100 that seems to be more in touch with liberty than Congress today. So in 1200, when the most evil king that England will ever know is on the throne, his name is John. History describes John and says even hell was fouled by the presence of John. Now, John was a massive taxation king. That's not why he was evil and oppressive. John was evil and oppressive because if you could not pay your taxes in John's day, which was highly likely, John had you arrested, imprisoned, mutilated, fingers, hands, tongues, ears, and executed. He was ruthless and vicious with his tax collection. You guys know John. You probably don't realize it. Have you heard of a man by the name of Robin Hood? That is the king in Robin Hood stories, John. You want to see how deep your socialist indoctrination goes? Robin Hood's claim to fame is to rob from the rich and give to the poor, right? No. Robin Hood was not engaged in the grand socialist experiment of redistribution of wealth. Robin Hood was not a socialist, he was a liberty fighter. You see, Robin Hood was not robbing from the rich and giving to the poor. Robin Hood was taking the money from the king and the crown that had been stolen from the people through oppressive taxation, returning it to the people so they could literally live. Because remember, John is murdering people, and Robin Hood is giving them back their life. Something else interesting about John's reign. Murdering people for not paying their taxes was not enough to bring a revolution. Because you see, when you have a society that's only concerned about economics, when you have a people who are only concerned about their own personal prosperity and provision, history proves that tyrants will always be able to trickle down just enough to make you a happy slave. That's why it's got to be about liberty and nothing else. But John made a fundamental error. All tyrants do. They get greedy and they grab more than they should. Because I believe John could have continued murdering people for quite some time before they had hit the end of the long train of abuses. But you see, the people of Great Britain had chosen a man by the name of Stephen Langton to be their archbishop. And Stephen Langton was not a friend of John. John said, I don't like this guy. I'm not going to allow him to be the head of your church. I'm going to pick who the head of your church is going to be. But John had forgotten about the 1100 Charter of Liberties, because the very first promise in the 1100 Charter of Liberties was that the church would be absolutely free from government intrusion. Sound familiar? The first aspect to our First Amendment. Did you catch that? We didn't invent it. We inherited it when a king in 1100 said that if the government is in your church, that is evil and oppressive. Now, if you have your pocket constitutions, I want you to close them, because I'm going to give you your first pop quiz of the day. I'm going to ask you a question, and I don't want you to answer out loud. I don't want you to mumble or whisper the answer. I don't even want you to lip sync the answer. Because I want it to be a personal assessment. And I want your neighbor to have the opportunity to have an honest personal assessment too. There are 5 individual protections in the First Amendment alone. 5 individual protections. Name all 5. We have a Supreme Court justice in Florida who took this poll and found out that only 2% of the people polled could name all 5. So I'm guessing there's some in here who could name only 4. There might be a few that could only name 3 or even 2, maybe even just the 1. So let me ask you this question. If you don't know what your rights are, how do you know they're not already gone? The Bill of Rights does not protect your rights. It was not designed to protect your rights. Can the Bill of Rights pick up a pen and write your congressman and demand that they follow the Bill of Rights in writing laws? No. Can the Bill of Rights go sit in your congressman's office and tell your congressman if he refuses to comply with the Constitution, he'll be fired? Can the Bill of Rights pick up a sword? You see, Richard Henry Lee, one of our famous forgotten founders, said that we had to have a Bill of Rights not to protect our rights, but to be a sentinel, to be an alarm for those unavoidable periods of inattentiveness, he said. Knowing throughout history that people become pacified in prosperity. They become lazy in luxury, and they fall asleep. He said, we must have this sentinel, so when that happens, and the government approaches that jewel, as Patrick Henry said, we will be wakened in our majesty, and we will be able to stand in defense. Problem is, the alarm has been sounding for decades, but because we do not know what our rights are, we have not been teaching reaching them, it is nothing more than a silent alarm. A revolution is brought against John, bringing us the second document in the genealogy of our Constitution. It's called the Magna Carta of 1215. So let me ask you something really quick. Before tonight, how many of you have heard of the Magna Carta? Before tonight, how many of you have heard of the 1100 Charter of Liberties and you didn't hear it from me? I don't understand it. Our historical studies, our constitutional studies love to start us at the Magna Carta, but they're cheating us. The Magna Carta is not a standalone document. The Magna Carta does not exist without the 1100 Charter of Liberties. And you miss something really, really huge in this understanding, this development of understanding of liberty in the people. Remember, these are still subjects to a king, with no more rights and privileges than the king determines belongs to them. In 1100, they have a promise from the king. The kings will no longer be evil and oppressive. In 1215, the Magna Carta is not written by the king. It is written by the people. It is the people saying, hey, you made us a promise in 1100 that kings would no longer be evil and oppressive. You obviously have no idea how to keep that promise. So we, the people, are now going to step up and issue a set of guidelines on how the king can run the kingdom and keep that promise. No more taxation without representation. And then creates that representation. A body of 25 men who will sit in the king's court, who will tell the king, no, you can't do that because it violates your promise. Kings who are still on the throne by divine right, not by election or appointment. They have no obligation to the people, are now having to be told by the people yes and no. You have to know that did not go over very well. Clauses 39 and 40 in the Magna Carta are the very seed to our 5th, 6th, and 7th Amendments. Our right to due process, habeas corpus, speedy trial, all become ours, not because we invented them in 1787, but because we inherited them when the people stood against a king. By the way, Clause 61 of the Magna Carta establishes the 5th right in our First Amendment. The right to petition the government of your grievances. We didn't invent that one either. Because you see, you have freedom of speech, or freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of press, the freedom to assemble, and the freedom to redress the government of your grievances. We didn't invent any of them. John signs the Magna Carta not because he thinks it's a great idea, but because he has a sword at his throat. And he would be removed from the throne a year later. The people would now have representation, a foothold in the real understanding of liberty, but now they are going to have to fight for 400 years to maintain that liberty and get any new advancements. The year is now 1620. The king is Charles I. If you're taking notes, you can also find out more about Charles by looking up Charles Stuart, S-T-U-A-R-T, Charles Stuart I. Charles is probably my favorite king in this whole study because he reminds me so much of my own king. You'll catch that in a minute. See, Charles is a massive spending king. The people recorded in history that Charles was famous for romping about Europe, spending on his every whim and fancy. Now, whose money was he spending? And how was he collecting their money? Taxes. Well, the Magna Carta says there's no taxation without representation anymore, right? Parliament gets tired of Charles' wasteful spending, stands up against Charles and says, you're going to stop this wasteful spending, we're not passing any more of your taxes until you do. Charles says, okay, fine. But let me remind you something. I'm king. What do I need Parliament for? he dissolves Parliament. Let me ask you, did he have to physically send them home? Or perhaps he could have said, where Parliament refuses to legislate, I'll just go ahead and regulate. Or maybe he had a State of the Kingdom address and said, if Parliament will not pass these laws, I will search every mechanism by which I will do it myself. Isn't that the same as dissolving Parliament? Declaring them irrelevant and without power? Well, Charles has got a predicament, because tyrants don't think logically. He's already violated the Magna Carta and dissolved Parliament, but he doesn't want to violate the Magna Carta anymore and pass a tax without Parliament being there. But you realize he's going to keep collecting the people's money. That was the whole purpose in dissolving Parliament. So he says, okay, fine, I'm king. I don't have to pass a law. I can simply issue a decree, because I'm king. And I won't call it a tax. I'll call it a forced loan. It's not a tax. It's a forced loan. What is another word for a forced loan? A mandate. 7 knights stood up to the king. By the way, who were the knights? What was their job? Protect the king, enforce the law, right? So basically the knights were the equivalent of our military leaders and our law enforcement agencies, all wrapped up in one. And so what you have is law enforcement officers standing up to the king saying, we will not enforce your unconstitutional law. We refuse to pay this tax. We refuse to collect this tax, because whether you call it a mandate or a tax, it is still tax without representation. Charles throws them in prison, denies them their habeas corpus, and they die there. But a revolution is born, bringing the 3rd document in the genealogy of our Constitution, the Petition of Right of 1628. You see, now they have the right to petition the government of their grievances, and this is a list of complaints against Charles on how he's violated the Magna Carta and broken the promise in the 1100 Charter of Liberties. It says there will be no taxation without representation, regardless of what you call it. We will have our right to habeas corpus, and while we're at it, you will not quarter soldiers in our homes, and you will not force martial law on us unless we're being invaded. Because we didn't invent the 3rd Amendment either. We inherited it. Now Charles signs the Petition of Right, much like John did, with a sword in his throat. But the people are not going to remove Charles. They're going to give Charles the benefit of the doubt. Perhaps they felt that Charles had learned the error of his ways. Maybe he said just the right things. But Charles has not learned.